Part 1: The mansion that refuses to stay silent. Have you ever walked past a mansion so beautiful, so perfectly kept, yet felt a chill crawl up your spine for no reason? On Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, stands one of the grandest homes in America's Gilded Age. Its marble walls shine in the sun, its gardens bloom in flawless perfection, yet locals whisper that behind those gates lies a curse so dark, they refuse to even speak the mansion's name aloud. Because in the early 1860s, 7 men died inside those walls. Each one connected to the same woman. Each one showing the same signs: violent convulsions, blackened fingernails, and the unmistakable bitter almond scent of arsenic poisoning. And here's the truly horrifying part. Decades later, evidence revealed the killer wasn't working alone. She was helped by her victims' own families. This is the hidden story of Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because stories like this, ones the wealthy tried to bury and historians tried to forget, are exactly what we uncover here. And let me know in the comments, what state are you watching from? Newport, 1861. Spring in Newport, Rhode Island, was a season of two worlds colliding. Across the country, America braced for civil war. Factories thundered in the north, plantations burned in the south, and young men prepared for battle. But in Newport, life couldn't be more different. This coastal town was a paradise for the rich, its mansions built like European palaces, its parties rivaling anything in Paris or London. On Bellevue Avenue, wealth was not just displayed, it was worshipped. Among these palaces stood one that seemed larger, grander, and colder than all the rest: Ravenscroft Manor, home to the Aldridge family. The House of Aldridge. Ravenscroft wasn't just a mansion. It was a symbol. 40 rooms of imported luxury, Italian marble, French crystal chandeliers, mahogany from the Caribbean. The house sat on the cliffs, overlooking the Atlantic, its tall windows catching the morning sun like golden eyes. At the center of it all stood Margaret Aldridge. At 47, Margaret was a widow of 3 years. Her husband, Edmund, had died in what was called a riding accident. But anyone who saw the way Margaret ran her household afterward could tell, this woman didn't crumble. She took control, she took power, and she never gave it back. Society men respected her, even feared her. She was tall, slim, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to measure the value of everything, and everyone, around her. Dressed always in deep blues and blacks, her look of eternal mourning only added to her strange allure. Her daughters were her greatest assets. Eleanor, 23, gentle and beautiful, the kind of woman suitors dreamed of marrying. Catherine, 21, sharp-witted and spirited, qualities her mother often tried to suppress. Margaret understood one thing clearly: her daughters' marriages weren't just about love. They were survival. Edmund had left debts, and the looming war threatened the Aldridge fortune. If her daughters married poorly, the family's empire could crumble. So when Eleanor announced her engagement in February 1861, Margaret knew she had found her salvation. The perfect match, or the perfect victim. Eleanor's fiancé, Charles Whitfield, was 26, tall, charming, and very rich. He came from a respected Boston family with deep ties to the textile industry, and a massive inheritance waiting for him upon marriage. To Newport society, this was a dream match. To Eleanor, it was a secure future. And to Margaret, it was something else entirely. Charles spent increasing amounts of time at Ravenscroft Manor. Margaret insisted on it. She said she wanted to know her future son-in-law. But her interest went far beyond polite family bonding. From the first moment she met him, Margaret saw Charles not as a man, but as an opportunity. His fortune, his doubts, his fears, even his heart, all of it, she decided, could be hers. The terrace scene. It began on a warm night in April, 2 months before the wedding. The manor was quiet, Eleanor at the piano, Catherine reading in the library, the servants cleaning after dinner. Margaret found Charles alone on the terrace, staring out at the moonlit ocean. He looked thoughtful, perhaps even troubled. Carrying 2 glasses of brandy, she joined him. "You seem troubled," Charles, she said softly. Surely not by thoughts of marriage to my daughter. He laughed nervously, accepting the glass. Not troubled, exactly. Just thinking about the future. The war, how quickly the world is changing. Sometimes I wonder if we're all living in a dream that's about to end. Margaret stepped closer. Too close. Dreams can be dangerous, she whispered. They make us forget what's real. What's valuable. Sometimes the most important things are right in front of us, and we don't even see them. Her perfume, her words, the warmth of her presence, it all unsettled him. What Charles didn't know was that his drink had been carefully laced with a mild sedative. Nothing deadly, just enough to make him pliable, confused, vulnerable. Their conversation stretched late into the night. Charles confessed his doubts, about money, about law school, even about whether he deserved Eleanor's love. Margaret listened, guided, and pressed, until he looked at her with eyes that should have been reserved for her daughter. You're not at all what I expected, he admitted. And what do you think of me now? Margaret asked, her gray eyes locking onto his. I think Eleanor is fortunate to have learned grace from such a remarkable woman. Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropped to a whisper. Some lessons, she said, can only be learned through experience. But she didn't take him then. No, Margaret was too clever to rush. Instead, she pulled back, leaving Charles confused, guilty, and strangely drawn to her. The watchful eyes. Inside, Eleanor played piano, believing her fiancé and mother were simply discussing wedding details. Catherine noticed Charles's strange unease later but dismissed it as pre-wedding nerves. The servants, trained to remain silent, said nothing. Only one person saw the truth beginning to form. Sarah Connolly, Margaret's loyal maid of 15 years. That night, as she prepared Margaret for bed, Sarah noticed something unusual. Her mistress studied her own reflection in the mirror, not with grief, not with age weariness, but with a satisfied smile. The kind of smile a predator wears after setting the first trap. Right finger. End of part 1. If you think the wedding will go as planned, think again. Because what happens next inside Ravenscroft Manor will turn Newport's most celebrated engagement into a trail of death, scandal, and secrets buried for decades. Make sure you're subscribed. Part 2 will uncover the first mysterious death at Ravenscroft, and the beginning of a killing spree hidden by wealth and power. Would you like me to outline all 10 parts now, like a roadmap of where the story goes? Build up, murders, cover up, discovery in 1924, etc., so you'll have a full series plan before I continue with part 2. Part 2. The Doctor's Warning. Movie camera hook opening for YouTube video. Imagine this. You're sitting in your study, sipping tea, when your trusted family doctor suddenly suggests your husband's tragic death might not have been an accident at all. That was the chilling moment in 1861 when Dr. William Hensley walked into Ravenscroft Manor and told Margaret Aldridge that whispers of murder were spreading through Newport's elite circles. And what makes this story even more horrifying? The man who had unknowingly started those whispers was none other than Charles Whitfield, Margaret's soon-to-be son-in-law. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is only part 2 of the chilling tale of the Newport poisoning ring. And let me know in the comments, have you ever visited a historic mansion that felt just a little too perfect, almost as if it was hiding something? The morning visitor. The morning after Margaret's unsettling but calculated interaction with Charles, Ravenscroft Manor received an unexpected guest. Dr. William Hensley had been the Aldridge family's physician for decades. He delivered both Eleanor and Catherine, treated fevers, injuries, and even Edmund's final illness. At 62, with silver hair and tired eyes, he carried the weight of too many deaths on his shoulders. When Sarah, the maid, announced him, Margaret greeted the doctor warmly and invited him into her private study. But the warmth ended there. His face was grim, his voice heavy. Margaret, he began carefully, there are questions being asked. Questions about Edmund's death. Margaret poured him tea, her hand steady, though inside her pulse raced. Questions. About a riding accident. Surely there can be nothing to question. Dr. Hensley hesitated. His symptoms, the convulsions, the darkened fingernails, the stomach pains. At the time, I believed they came from internal injuries. But other physicians, men familiar with poisoning cases, suggest they point to something else entirely. The word poisoning hung unspoken in the air, as heavy as the silence between them. Margaret placed her teacup down with practiced calm. "Doctor, are you suggesting my husband was murdered? By whom, and for what reason?" "I am suggesting nothing, Drive," Hensley said quickly. "But rumors have begun, and if they spread to the wrong ears, they could cause difficulties. The seed of suspicion. What Margaret didn't know yet was who had planted those rumors. It was Charles, not because he suspected Margaret, but because of his curiosity as a trained lawyer. He had been reviewing the Aldridge family's financial records ahead of the marriage. In those documents, he noticed troubling details. Changes to Edmund's will, adjustments to insurance policies, all within months of his death. And every single change heavily favored Margaret. At a recent dinner at the Vanderbilt mansion, Charles casually mentioned Edmund's death to a Boston physician named James Morrison, who specialized in suspected poisoning. Charles spoke of it as a tragic accident, but when he described the symptoms, Morrison's face darkened. The conversation spread. Morrison shared his suspicions with colleagues. Soon, Newport's medical community buzzed with whispers. Was Edmund Aldridge's accident really an accident? And that was why Hensley, old and loyal, came to warn Margaret. A predator's smile. Margaret thanked him for his honesty, promised she welcomed any inquiry, and dismissed him with her usual poise. But the moment he left, her mask cracked. She sat alone in her study, staring out at the restless Atlantic Ocean, calculating. She had always known Edmund's death might one day be questioned. She had prepared for it. But she had never expected the danger to come from Charles, the very man meant to secure her family's future. That night, as Sarah brushed her hair, the maid dared a comment. "You seem pleased with the evening, ma'am." Margaret's smile was not the gentle smile of a grieving widow. It was cold, sharp, predatory. "Yes, Sarah," she said slowly, "everything is proceeding exactly as it should. From widow to mastermind. Until that moment, Margaret had been a woman who killed once, perhaps out of necessity. But now, her thinking shifted. She would not merely survive suspicion, she would use it. She would turn Charles from a threat into a weapon. Her plan was audacious. Seduce Charles. Bind him with secrets and guilt. Use his legal knowledge to build airtight accidents for anyone who posed a danger. And if necessary, sacrifice even her daughters. Charles would not just be her daughter's fiancé. He would become her accomplice. The night visit. That very night, Margaret acted. She poured his brandy stronger than usual, this time with more than a mild sedative. Enough to cloud his judgment, stir his blood, and keep him awake in a haze between dream and reality. When she entered his guest room past midnight, Charles was already restless, his mind fogged, his body hot. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. She whispered comfort, shared confidences, and allowed him to believe he was rescuing her from years of silent suffering. By morning, the bond was sealed. He was not only unfaithful to Eleanor, he was entangled with her mother in a web of secrets and shame. The confession that should never have existed. Decades later, in 1924, when workers renovating Ravenscroft discovered hidden compartments behind the library walls, they found a collection of letters and documents. Among them, a confession written in Charles Whitfield's own hand. On the envelope he had scrawled, "To be opened only upon my death." Inside, Charles described his first night with Margaret in chilling detail. The confession was so scandalous, so damning, that historians debated destroying it. But it survived, and today it stands as proof of how Margaret ensnared him. The change in Charles. In the days that followed, Charles was different. Eleanor noticed he was distracted, his eyes distant, his smile strained. When she asked, he assured her everything was fine, but the warmth was gone. Catherine, sharper than her sister, noticed something else. Charles now sought out private talks with Margaret. In the library, on the terrace, in the study, their heads bent close together, voices hushed. When she confronted Eleanor about it, her older sister brushed it off. "Of course Charles wants to get along with Mother," Eleanor said innocently. "He's about to be family." But Catherine wasn't so sure. A dark education. The truth was far worse than either sister imagined. Margaret had told Charles everything. She admitted Edmund hadn't died by accident. She confessed to poisoning him, but painted herself as the victim of an abusive husband who had left her no choice. "Edmund was going to ruin us," she whispered to Charles. "Divorce me, disinherit the girls, leave us penniless. I did what I had to do for my family." Charles, torn between horror and fascination, found himself unable to turn away. Margaret had trapped him, not just with seduction, but with the dangerous knowledge that he now shared. He wasn't merely Eleanor's fiancé anymore. He was Margaret's partner. Right finger end of part 2. And this is where things truly begin to spiral. Because once Charles crossed that line, he could never go back. What started as whispers of suspicion would soon become a trail of deaths that Newport's wealthiest families worked desperately to cover up. Make sure you're subscribed. Part 3 will reveal the first mysterious death after Charles joined Margaret's circle, and the chilling pattern that began to emerge inside Ravenscroft Manor. Would you like me to map out all 10 parts' brief outlines first so you have a clear roadmap of where the story heads, or should I continue writing full 1,000-word episodes one by one? Ghost Ravenscroft Manor, Part 3. A horror historic story inspired by true Gothic darkness. Hook. Some secrets don't just stay buried, they claw their way back, dragging everyone into their darkness. And at Ravenscroft Manor, every whisper in the hall, every shadow in the wine cellar, carried the weight of blood and betrayal. This is part 3 of the chilling tale of Margaret Aldridge, Charles Whitfield, and Eleanor's fight for truth. Charles Whitfield once believed himself an honorable man. A lawyer, a gentleman, a man who came to Newport with nothing more sinister in mind than marrying the woman he loved, Eleanor Aldridge. But by now, that man was slipping away. Piece by piece, Margaret Aldridge, Eleanor's mother, was reshaping him into something darker. Something dangerous. Margaret's web. It started with tears. Margaret knew how to use them, not as weakness, but as weapons. "I never wanted to become this person," she whispered to Charles during one of their secret meetings, tears glistening on her cheeks like diamonds. But when a mother must choose between her soul and her daughter's future, what choice is left? Her words pierced his heart. Charles, already racked with guilt over betraying Eleanor with Margaret, wanted to believe her. He told himself he wasn't helping a murderer, he was protecting Eleanor, protecting Catherine, protecting the family. The first task she gave him seemed harmless: review the Aldridge estate documents. No poison, no crime, just paperwork. Charles, eager to prove useful, agreed. But the papers didn't hide. They screamed. The pattern of death. Charles discovered a chilling sequence: wills rewritten, insurance policies shifted, property deeds altered, all aligning perfectly before the deaths of Edmund Aldridge and 2 other men tied to the family. One was Margaret's first husband, dead in a boating accident. The second, more shocking, was Thomas Richardson, Eleanor's former fiancé. Charles had known Thomas at Harvard. Strong, athletic, a man who could control a horse with ease. Yet he supposedly died in a carriage accident on a calm evening. The facts didn't fit. When Charles confronted Margaret, expecting denial, she didn't flinch. "Yes," she admitted softly. "Thomas discovered too much about Edmund. He was going to expose me. I had no choice." Her tone was calm, almost reasonable. She painted murder not as cruelty, but as strategy. Not as bloodlust, but as survival. And the most terrifying part? Charles found himself almost admiring her. The monstrous proposal. Margaret's final reveal twisted the knife deeper. "Eleanor is asking questions," she said, her voice heavy with false concern. "She's writing to Boston. If she keeps digging, she'll destroy us all, including you, Charles. Do you want your career ruined? Your reputation shattered?" Then came the plan. Simple, elegant, horrifying. Eleanor would have to die. For the family, for Catherine, for Charles himself. At that moment, Charles should have fled. He should have gone straight to the police. Instead, he nodded, asking questions about timing and methods like a man reviewing a contract. The Honorable Charles Whitfield was gone. In his place stood Margaret Aldridge's accomplice. Eleanor's suspicion. But Eleanor was not blind. One rainy morning in May, she found her mother and Charles in the wine cellar, huddled close, whispering urgently over a dusty old bottle. When she entered, both froze like children caught stealing sweets. "We were just selecting wine for dinner," Margaret said smoothly. "Charles has grown quite fond of our cellar." But Eleanor noticed two things. First, the bottle wasn't one her mother ever used casually, it was too rare, too valuable. Second, Charles had slipped something into his pocket before she arrived. At dinner that night, Eleanor's suspicions grew. She watched her mother and her fiancé carefully, the glances, the subtle touches, the way Charles hung on Margaret's every word. Then she mentioned a letter she'd received, from Thomas Richardson's sister in Boston, still asking about her brother's death. The reaction was instant. Charles dropped his wineglass, red liquid spilling like blood across the tablecloth. Margaret froze, her fork midway to her lips. "Grief affects people differently," Margaret said with careful calm. "Some need someone to blame." But Eleanor saw it then, the coldness in her mother's eyes. The calculation. And she felt something she had never felt in her own home before, fear. The attic discovery. That night, Eleanor made a choice. She would search Thomas's belongings, which had been locked away in the attic since his death. Among his clothes, she found a leather portfolio. Inside, notes, observations, suspicions, evidence. Thomas had been investigating Edmund's death. He had collected testimony from servants, documented strange symptoms, and questioned Margaret's account. At the bottom of the trunk lay a letter, unsent, addressed to the Newport police chief. Dated 3 days before his death. In it, Thomas accused Margaret Aldridge directly. Eleanor's hands shook as she read. The truth was undeniable. Thomas hadn't died by accident. He had been silenced. And now Eleanor knew, Charles, the man she was supposed to marry, was somehow entangled in the same deadly web. She wasn't just living with danger. She was its next target. End of part 3. At Ravenscroft Manor, love had curdled into betrayal, and protection had become a mask for murder. Eleanor now carried the weight of a deadly secret, but the walls of the manor had ears, and Margaret always stayed one step ahead. What Eleanor didn't know was that her discovery had already sealed her fate. Fire. Stay tuned for part 4, The Attic Whispers, where Eleanor's search for truth collides with Ravenscroft's darkest shadows. Ghost Ravenscroft Manor, Part 4. A horror historic story inspired by Gothic darkness. Hook. Some houses keep secrets in their walls. Others hide them in their attics. At Ravenscroft Manor, the attic was not just a room of dust and memories, it was a graveyard of truth. And Eleanor Aldridge had just unearthed the evidence that would mark her for death. This is part 4 of the chilling tale of Ravenscroft Manor. Eleanor's discovery. The trunk sat heavy in the attic's shadows, its leather cracked with age. Inside, Eleanor had found Thomas Richardson's portfolio, proof that her late fiancé had been investigating her mother's crimes. The unsent letter to the Newport police chief shook her most. 3 days before his death, Thomas had written words that accused Margaret Aldridge directly of Edmund's murder. As the storm outside rattled the manor's windows, Eleanor clutched the letter, her mind racing. Her mother, the woman who tucked her into bed as a child, who had hosted society's grandest dinners, was a killer. And Charles, the man she thought would protect her, was now Margaret's accomplice. Eleanor realized she couldn't trust anyone within the house. Shadows in the attic. Just as she tucked the letter back into the trunk, a sound froze her blood. Creak. The attic door. Her candle flickered. For a moment, Eleanor thought she was imagining it. But then, another creak, heavier this time. Someone was coming. She snuffed the candle, clutching the letter to her chest. The attic filled with darkness, only the silver glow of moonlight through the small window guiding her. She slipped behind an old wardrobe, holding her breath. Footsteps entered. Slow, careful, Searching. Then a voice. Low. Male. Eleanor, are you up here? It was Charles. Her heart pounded. If he found her, he'd know she had discovered the truth. And with Margaret's plan already in motion, Eleanor would not leave that attic alive. Escape. Charles's footsteps grew closer, echoing on the wooden floorboards. She could almost feel him searching. Eleanor spotted her chance, a narrow servant's staircase tucked in the corner, half hidden by old trunks. Quietly, she slipped down the steps, every movement measured. Charles called her name again, but his voice no longer carried concern. It carried suspicion. She fled into the hall below, heart hammering, the letter pressed against her chest like a lifeline. That night, Eleanor barely slept. She kept Thomas's papers hidden beneath her mattress, vowing to leave Ravenscroft at first light. But she underestimated her mother's reach. Margaret's watch. Margaret Aldridge noticed everything. The next morning, over tea, she studied Eleanor with the sharp gaze of a hawk. You look pale, darling, Margaret said smoothly. Up late reading again. Eleanor forced a smile. Just restless. Margaret's lips curved faintly. She knew. Eleanor felt it in her bones. When Charles arrived later that morning, Margaret whispered something in his ear. He glanced at Eleanor, his expression a mixture of guilt and menace. Eleanor realized she had only hours left before her secret was discovered. The servant's warning. As Eleanor prepared her escape, an unlikely ally emerged. Clara, one of the housemaids, approached her in the corridor. Her hands trembled as she passed Eleanor a folded scrap of paper. Miss, she whispered, eyes darting nervously. I shouldn't, but you need to know. Eleanor unfolded the note. It was a warning. Leave before nightfall. Your mother knows. Clara's face was pale. I heard her speaking with Mr. Whitfield in the cellar. They were talking about wine, but also about you. Please, miss, go. Eleanor's blood turned cold. She nodded, whispering, thank you, Clara. But leaving Ravenscroft Manor was not so simple. The family's carriages were always attended, and servants reported directly to Margaret. Eleanor would need to be clever. A trap at dinner. That evening, Margaret hosted a small dinner. Only Charles, Eleanor, and Catherine were present, but the meal was prepared with unusual care. Margaret poured wine herself, an old vintage from the very bottle Eleanor had seen in the cellar days before. To family, Margaret said with a chilling smile, raising her glass. Charles followed suit. Catherine, innocent and unaware, sipped happily. Eleanor stared at the glass in front of her. The red liquid glistened like blood under candlelight. She remembered the cellar. She remembered Charles pocketing something. Her mother was trying to poison her. With steady hands, Eleanor lifted the glass to her lips, then pretended to cough, spilling the wine onto the floor. Oh, how clumsy of me, she said quickly, forcing a laugh. Margaret's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Charles's jaw tightened. Eleanor's act had bought her time, but not much. Flight into darkness. That night, when the manor had gone still, Eleanor packed what little she could. She wrapped Thomas's papers tightly and slipped into the servants' passageways. She intended to reach Newport by foot, find Thomas's sister, and place the evidence in safe hands. But as she crept toward the side entrance, she heard voices behind her. Margaret's. Charles's. She knows, Margaret said coldly. We can't wait any longer. Do it tonight. Eleanor ran. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floors as she darted through corridors lit only by moonlight. The grand halls of Ravenscroft, once her childhood home, now felt like a labyrinth of death. She reached the side door, but it was bolted from the outside. Behind her, Charles's footsteps grew louder. Eleanor, he shouted, don't make this harder. She sprinted up the staircase instead, clutching the papers, her lungs burning. If she couldn't escape, she would hide. The attic whispers. The only place left was the attic. She slammed the door shut behind her and pressed her body against it, listening to Charles's footsteps on the stairs. Her candle flickered as shadows danced across the dusty beams. Desperation drove her toward Thomas's trunk. She pulled it open again, searching for anything, a weapon, a clue, a way out. Instead, she found something worse. At the very bottom of the trunk, hidden beneath false lining, was a small glass vial. Dark residue clung to its edges. A faint, bitter smell of almonds filled the air. Poison. Thomas hadn't simply discovered Edmund's suspicious death, he had found Margaret's method. And that discovery had cost him his life. As Eleanor held the vial, she heard Charles's hand rattle the attic door. There was no time left. End of part 4. The walls of Ravenscroft groaned with storm winds as Eleanor realized she was trapped in the very room where truth and death collided. The attic held evidence of her mother's crimes, but also the noose tightening around her own life. And now, Charles was at the door. Fire. Stay tuned for part 5, The Poisoned Legacy, where Eleanor's desperate struggle for survival brings her face to face with the manor's darkest secrets. Ghost Ravenscroft Manor, Part 5. A horror historic story inspired by Gothic darkness. Hook. What happens when the people sworn to protect you become the very ones plotting your death? At Ravenscroft Manor, Eleanor Aldridge is about to learn that trust is deadlier than poison. This is part 5 of the chilling saga of Ravenscroft Manor. The attic door. The attic door shook violently under Charles's grip. Eleanor, he shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Open the door. You don't understand what you've found. She clutched the vial of poison in one hand, Thomas's papers in the other. Her heart pounded like a drum, each beat echoing through her chest. I understand enough, Eleanor whispered, though she dared not raise her voice. The door rattled again, then silence. Eleanor strained her ears. For a long, dreadful moment, she thought Charles had left. But then she heard his whisper, low and chilling, meant only for her. Your mother was right. You should never have gone into that trunk. Margaret's net. The next morning, Eleanor awoke on the attic floor. Exhaustion had overtaken her after hours of fearful waiting. When she finally crept downstairs, the manor felt different. Every servant's glance lingered too long. Doors that were once left open were now shut. The air was heavy with suspicion, as though the entire house had been told to watch her. At breakfast, Margaret sat at the head of the table, regal and composed, while Catherine hummed softly beside her. Charles entered last, his eyes avoiding Eleanor's. Margaret raised her teacup. Sleep well, darling. Eleanor forced a nod. Yes, mother. But inside, her blood ran cold. Margaret knew everything. A mother's mask. After breakfast, Margaret asked Eleanor to join her in the study. The heavy oak door closed behind them with a final sounding thud. Margaret poured tea, her movements graceful, deliberate, almost theatrical. My dear, Margaret began softly, I know you've been troubled. You've lost a father, a fiancé, and now you worry about the future. But I promise, everything I've done, it was all for you and Catherine. Eleanor stared, trying to read the truth behind her mother's mask. Is that what Thomas believed? Eleanor asked quietly. That you killed to protect us? Margaret's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. Thomas was foolish. He asked too many questions. And questions, Eleanor, can be dangerous. Eleanor's hands trembled as she set her teacup down. And me? What happens to me now that I know the truth? Margaret leaned closer, her perfume sickly sweet. That depends, my darling, on whether you can keep a secret. Charles's torment. Later that evening, Eleanor cornered Charles in the library. Books towered above them, silent witnesses to the confrontation. Why? She demanded, her voice low but sharp. Why would you stand beside her after what she's done? Charles looked broken, his face pale, his hands trembling as he rubbed his temple. You don't understand, he whispered. She's not what you think. She murdered my father. She murdered Thomas. Eleanor hissed. Charles's jaw clenched. And she told me, Edmund was going to ruin you. Divorce, scandal, financial ruin. You'd have been left with nothing. She said she did it to protect you. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Margaret had poisoned Charles's mind as surely as she poisoned her victims. You think betrayal is protection? She snapped. You think killing me will protect me? Charles's silence was answer enough. The poisoned legacy. That night, Eleanor returned to her room to find a small silver tray waiting on her desk. Upon it sat a crystal glass filled with amber liquid. A note lay beside it, written in her mother's elegant hand. To help you sleep, Mother. Eleanor's throat tightened. She lifted the glass, bringing it close enough to smell. The faint, bitter almond scent was unmistakable. Her hands shook violently. For a moment, she considered throwing the glass against the wall. But then a thought struck her. This poison could be her weapon. She carefully poured the liquid into a small vial she kept for perfume, sealing it tightly before hiding it in her jewelry box. If her mother wanted to play this game, Eleanor would no longer be the helpless daughter. Catherine's innocence. The following day, Eleanor tried to warn Catherine. Catherine, she whispered while they walked the gardens, something's terribly wrong. Mother, she isn't what she seems. You must be careful. Catherine laughed lightly, plucking a rose from its stem. Eleanor, you're being dramatic. Mother has always looked after us. Why would she harm her own children? Eleanor gripped her sister's arm desperately. Because anyone who threatens her secrets is in danger, even us. Catherine pulled away, her expression hardening. I think grief has clouded your mind. Perhaps you should rest. Eleanor's heart broke. Her sister was blind to the danger, and Margaret had succeeded in keeping Catherine under her spell. The midnight chase. That night, Eleanor's worst fears came true. She awoke to the sound of her door unlocking. Moonlight spilled across the floor as the door creaked open. Charles stood there, holding a lantern. Eleanor, he whispered, his face pale and hollow. Come with me. Your mother says, it has to be tonight. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She pretended to comply, slipping from her bed and following him into the hall. But the moment he turned his back, she darted into the shadows, racing toward the servants' passageway. Charles shouted her name, his footsteps pounding behind her. The grand halls of Ravenscroft became a nightmare maze, the walls she had known since childhood now echoing with the chase of a man who was once her protector. She stumbled into the kitchen, nearly knocking over a pot. Grabbing a knife from the counter, she pressed herself into the corner, gasping for breath. Charles entered moments later, the lantern casting his shadow across the room like a monster. Eleanor, stop this madness. He cried. If you'd only trust her, trust us, none of this would be necessary. His voice cracked, a man torn apart by love, guilt, and corruption. But Eleanor saw only a stranger. Cornered, Charles stepped closer, his hands raised as if approaching a wild animal. Put the knife down, please. Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You were supposed to love me. You were supposed to protect me. I am protecting you, he cried, his voice breaking. Don't you see, your mother and I, we've built something that will last forever. If you'd just stop fighting. A sound cut him off. The slow, deliberate click of heels on the marble floor. Margaret entered the kitchen, dressed in black silk, her expression serene. My poor children, she said softly, her eyes sweeping over them both. How quickly love turns to fear. But don't worry, Eleanor, soon, you won't have to be afraid anymore. She carried in her hand another crystal vial. And this one was meant for Eleanor. End of part 5. The kitchen filled with the scent of poison and fear as Margaret Aldridge closed in on her daughter. Eleanor stood trembling, caught between the man who betrayed her and the mother who had turned murder into survival. And in that moment, one thing became terrifyingly clear: Ravenscroft Manor would not let them all leave alive. Fire. Stay tuned for part 6, The Mother's Gambit, where the deadly game between Eleanor and Margaret reaches its breaking point. Part 6. Shadows in the walls of Ravenscroft Manor. They say every old house holds secrets, but Ravenscroft Manor was built from secrets. Its stones had soaked in blood, lies, and whispers for generations. And by the time Eleanor uncovered Thomas Richardson's hidden notes, she realized the walls around her weren't just history, they were traps closing in. Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched Thomas's unfinished letter to the police. The attic air was heavy with dust, but what pressed hardest on her chest was fear. Fear of her own mother. Fear of Charles, the man she had once thought her protector. And fear of herself, for being too blind, too trusting, for too long. She wanted to run, leave Ravenscroft that very night, board the first carriage to Boston, and deliver the evidence into safe hands. But she hesitated. Something inside her whispered that if she moved too quickly, she wouldn't make it out alive. Margaret had eyes everywhere. Servants, neighbors, even Charles. So Eleanor did the most dangerous thing of all. She pretended. That evening, she came down from the attic with a calm smile and joined her mother and Charles at supper as if nothing had happened. The three of them sat beneath the glittering chandelier, silverware clinking softly against china plates. But for Eleanor, every sound was louder, sharper, the scrape of Charles's knife, the deliberate sip of her mother's wine. Margaret, dressed in black silk with a ruby brooch at her throat, seemed almost regal as she asked Eleanor about her day. "You look pale, my dear. Have you been tiring yourself with too much reading again?" Eleanor forced a laugh. "Just a little. The weather gave me a headache." Charles's eyes lingered on her. Too long, too searching. She felt as though he could see the folded letter hidden in her sleeve, could hear the pounding of her heart. Then came the moment that chilled her to the bone. Margaret leaned across the table and said softly, "You know, Eleanor, sometimes curiosity can be dangerous. Especially when it concerns the past. The dead should be left in peace." Eleanor froze. Was it a warning, or a confession? That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked the corridors of Ravenscroft. The manor was alive with sounds, the groan of timber, the distant rattle of windows in the wind, the faint drip of water in the cellar. But as she passed her father's old study, she heard something else. A voice, whispering. She pressed her ear to the heavy oak door. It was Charles. His tone was urgent, almost desperate. "We must act before she discovers more. If she writes to Boston again, it will bring ruin. I can't risk it, Margaret. We can't risk it." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Her mother's reply came, low and steady, like steel sliding from a sheath. "Then we agree. It must happen soon, quietly. The river, perhaps, or an unfortunate fall from the cliffs. People will weep, but no one will question." Eleanor staggered back, nearly crying out, but she bit her lip until she tasted blood. They were planning her death. Her own mother and her beloved fiancé. The next day brought a cruel test. Margaret announced a family outing, a carriage ride along the coastal cliffs. "The sea air will do us good," she said brightly, her eyes gleaming with false cheer. Eleanor knew exactly what this was. A trap, a staged accident, but she had no choice but to agree. Refusing would expose her suspicion and accelerate their plan. So she put on her bonnet, tied her shawl, and climbed into the carriage beside Charles, who smelled faintly of tobacco and unease. The ride was beautiful at first. The Atlantic stretched blue and endless, waves crashing against black rocks far below. But Eleanor could hardly breathe. Every turn of the wheels, every jolt of the horse, brought them closer to the cliff's edge. Then, suddenly, the reins snapped. The horses bolted. The carriage lurched wildly toward the drop. Eleanor screamed as the cliffside loomed. Charles pulled her arm, not to save her, but to steady himself. For a split second, she saw the truth in his eyes. He would let her die. But fate, or perhaps something darker, intervened. One wheel struck a hidden rock, shattering into splinters. The carriage toppled, but not over the cliff. Instead, it crashed into a thicket of twisted trees, throwing its passengers hard to the ground. Eleanor awoke with blood on her face, her head ringing but alive. Charles groaned nearby, his arm bent unnaturally. Margaret, astonishingly, was unhurt, her black dress untouched, her brooch still gleaming. And when Eleanor looked at her mother, she swore she saw disappointment in her eyes. That night, Eleanor lay in bed, her body aching, her mind racing. She realized she could not survive much longer within Ravenscroft's walls. Yet she also understood something terrifying. Margaret was not merely protecting the family. She was orchestrating a legacy of blood. Edmund, Thomas, perhaps even her first husband, all sacrifices to Margaret's cold ambition. But there was something else Eleanor hadn't yet explained. Why Ravenscroft itself seemed alive. Why, in the darkest hours, she sometimes felt watched by eyes that weren't human. Why shadows moved against the stone walls even when no one walked the halls. Because Ravenscroft was more than just Margaret's domain. It was hungry, and Eleanor, with her discovery of truth, had awakened it. The final horror of Part 6 came at midnight. Eleanor, half dreaming, heard the creak of her bedroom door. She thought it was Margaret or Charles come to finish their work. But when she opened her eyes, she saw something far worse. A figure stood at the foot of her bed. Not her mother, not Charles. It was her father, or what was left of him. His riding coat hung in tatters, his face pale and broken, neck twisted at an unnatural angle. His lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed words that chilled her soul. Trust no one. The house remembers. The house will take its due. Eleanor screamed, but the figure dissolved into shadow, leaving only the cold imprint of hooves echoing in the corridor. And so Part 6 ends, with Eleanor caught between the living who plotted her death, and the dead who demanded justice. Ravenscroft Manor was closing its grip, and Eleanor knew the next days would decide not just her fate, but the fate of everyone bound to the cursed estate. Right finger, would you like me to continue with Part 7 where Eleanor starts fighting back against her mother and Charles, while the supernatural forces of Ravenscroft rise even stronger? Part 7. The house demands its due. Some families inherit jewels, others inherit land, but the Aldridges had inherited something far darker, a bargain sealed in shadows, whispered through blood. And Eleanor was beginning to understand that her family's fortune had been purchased with death. The morning after her father's ghost appeared, Eleanor woke drenched in sweat. She told herself it had been a nightmare, yet the memory of his twisted neck and the hollow echo of hooves refused to fade. Worse, the air in her room still carried a strange chill, though the fireplace logs glowed with dying embers. It felt as if someone, or something, was still there, watching. She forced herself to rise. Weakness meant death, and she couldn't afford it. If her mother and Charles were plotting her end, she had to stay sharp, vigilant, ready. At breakfast, Margaret and Charles behaved as if nothing unusual had happened on the cliffs the day before. Margaret sipped her tea with calm grace, and Charles, his arm bound in a sling, managed a weak smile when Eleanor entered. "My poor dear," Margaret said smoothly, "what a dreadful accident yesterday was." "Thank heavens we survived." "Yes," Eleanor answered carefully, "thank heavens indeed." But her eyes lingered on Charles. He looked pale, guilty, yet bound to Margaret like a moth to flame. Eleanor wondered, did he fear her mother as much as she did? Or had he already surrendered his soul to her completely? That afternoon, Eleanor ventured once more into the attic. She needed answers. If Thomas Richardson had uncovered the truth about Edmund's death, perhaps there was more, some deeper secret that explained why Ravenscroft itself seemed haunted. The trunk gave her what she sought. Beneath a layer of folded shirts, she discovered an old journal. Not Thomas's, but Edmund's, her father's. Its pages, inked in a strong but hurried hand, spoke of sleepless nights, strange whispers in the halls, and the unshakable feeling that Ravenscroft demanded sacrifice. Edmund had written of Margaret, too, her cold stares, her late-night wanderings, the way she seemed to speak with the house as if it were a living thing. One entry chilled Eleanor more than all the rest. Greater than, Margaret has shown me the truth. Ravenscroft was never built for comfort. It was built as a vessel. The walls hold bargains. The stones hunger. The house protects those who feed it. And it devours those who resist. Eleanor's blood froze. Her father had known. He had feared Margaret, yet he had been powerless to resist her. And in the end, the house had taken him. That night, Eleanor locked her bedroom door. But the lock meant nothing to Ravenscroft. At midnight, the scratching began. A faint sound at first, like branches against glass. Then louder, closer, nails dragging along the inside of her walls. Eleanor sat upright, clutching a candle. "Who's there?" she whispered. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed in. Then, a voice. A man's voice, muffled but clear, speaking from within the wall itself. "Get out while you can." Eleanor screamed, dropping the candle. Its flame sputtered out, leaving her in Darkness. The walls trembled, dust raining from the ceiling. And for one terrible moment, she thought she heard laughter, low, cruel, echoing through the beams. Dash dash dash. By dawn, Eleanor was no longer afraid. She was furious. Margaret might command Charles, might manipulate the town with her widow's charm and influence, but Eleanor was not a child anymore. She would not be the next Aldridge accident. She confronted her mother in the drawing room, where shafts of pale morning light glinted on gilt-framed portraits of grim-faced ancestors. "Mother," she said, voice steady though her hands trembled, "I know the truth about Father. About Thomas. About this house." Margaret looked up from her embroidery, her face unreadable. "Do you, now?" "Yes. And I know you plan to kill me." For the briefest moment, a shadow flickered across Margaret's face. Then she smiled, a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "My dear Eleanor," she said softly, "you think too highly of yourself. Do you imagine the world revolves around your suspicions? Death comes to all, some sooner, some later. But if you continue speaking such nonsense, you may hasten your own." Eleanor's anger flared. "You killed Father. You killed Thomas. And now you want to kill me. But I won't let you. I'll tell the world what you've done." Margaret set down her needlework with deliberate calm. "No, Eleanor, you won't, because the house won't allow it. Ravenscroft protects its own. Dash dash dash." That evening, Eleanor made her choice. She would escape. She packed Thomas's notes, her father's journal, and a small purse of coins into a satchel. At midnight, while Margaret and Charles slept, she would slip out through the servants' entrance and flee to Boston. But Ravenscroft had other plans. As the clock struck 12, Eleanor crept down the back stairwell. The air was damp, heavy, smelling of earth and mildew. She reached the narrow door that led into the night, and found it bolted from the outside. Her heart pounded. Someone new. Then, behind her, a floorboard creaked. She spun around. Charles stood in the shadows, sling gone from his arm, his face pale but his eyes burning with strange intensity. "Eleanor," he whispered, "don't run. You'll only make it worse." "Worse?" Her voice cracked. "You mean worse than my own mother plotting to kill me?" Charles stepped closer, hands trembling. "You don't understand. Ravenscroft doesn't let people leave. Not me, not you, not anyone. Once you're bound to this house, it owns you." Eleanor backed against the locked door, clutching her satchel. "You're lying." But deep down, she knew he wasn't. Dash dash dash. At that moment, the walls themselves groaned. Plaster cracked, dust falling in clouds. From the staircase above, Eleanor heard Margaret's calm, deliberate footsteps. Charles's eyes widened in terror. "She's coming." And Eleanor realized, with a rush of icy clarity, that Charles was no longer her enemy, he was another prisoner of Ravenscroft caught in her mother's snare. The house wanted them both. Dash dash dash. Part 7 ends with Eleanor cornered between Charles, who begged her not to flee, and Margaret, descending with slow, measured steps. And all around them, Ravenscroft shuddered, as though eager to claim its next sacrifice. Dash dash dash. Right finger, would you like me to continue with Part 8, where Eleanor tries to outsmart both her mother and the house itself, discovering the true origin of Ravenscroft's curse? Part 8, The Curse of Ravenscroft. Some houses are built from stone and timber. Ravenscroft was built from secrets. And like all secrets, it demanded to be fed. Dash dash dash. Eleanor's heart pounded as Margaret's footsteps echoed down the stairwell. The flickering candlelight made shadows twist along the walls, and for a moment Eleanor imagined the house itself. Leaning in, listening, Charles stood frozen, torn between fear and loyalty. His lips moved as if he wanted to warn her, but no words came. Eleanor clutched her satchel tighter. She would not die in this house. "Mother," she called, forcing her voice to steady, "what do you want from me?" Margaret appeared at the bottom of the staircase, her silk robe trailing like a shadow behind her. Her face was calm, but her eyes gleamed with something sharp and merciless. "What I've always wanted," she said softly. "Survival. And you, Eleanor, are a threat to everything I've built." Dash dash dash. Margaret raised a hand, and Charles flinched as though struck. "You've seen too much," she continued. "Thomas learned too much. And your father, well, Edmund was weak. Ravenscroft chooses who lives and who dies. We do not question its will. Eleanor felt the walls pulse around her, as if the house approved of Margaret's words. She gritted her teeth. You're wrong. The house isn't alive. You are. And you've killed for your own gain, not because of some curse. But Margaret only laughed, a low, cold sound that made Charles step back. Oh, Eleanor, you still don't understand. The curse is real. Ravenscroft has always required blood. Do you think our family's fortune came from clever business alone? No, it came from sacrifice. Every generation, someone pays. Eleanor's mind raced. If that were true, then perhaps her father's journal had not been the ramblings of a broken man but a warning. Ravenscroft had devoured him, just as it had devoured Thomas. And now it wanted her. Margaret's gaze hardened. The choice is simple. Stay, accept your place, and the house may spare you. Resist, and it will take you tonight. At that moment, the walls groaned again, louder than before, plaster raining like dust from the ceiling beams. The floor beneath Eleanor's feet shuddered as if something enormous stirred below the foundations. Charles suddenly stepped forward. Margaret, stop this. You don't need to do this to her. She's your daughter. Margaret turned her head slowly, her smile sharp as glass. And you, Charles, are a fool. Do you think you're here because of love? No, you were chosen, like Edmund, like Thomas. Ravenscroft selects its players. You belong to the house now, as much as I do. Charles's face went white. He looked at Eleanor with wide, desperate eyes. She's telling the truth, he whispered. I tried to leave once. The night before our engagement was announced. I packed my bags. But the gates, they wouldn't open. The iron froze like ice when I touched it. I couldn't leave. Eleanor shook her head violently. No, there must be a way out. There has to be. Margaret stepped closer, her voice now soft, almost tender. Yes, Eleanor, there is a way. One life, freely given, will release another. That is the law of Ravenscroft. You can live, if you choose who dies in your place. Eleanor's stomach twisted. This was the truth of her family's wealth, murder, wrapped in the disguise of fate. She realized then why Margaret always seemed calm, even cold. She had embraced the bargain. She was Ravenscroft's willing servant. No, Eleanor said firmly. I won't kill for you. I won't be like you. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. Then you will be consumed. The next days blurred into a nightmare. Eleanor could not leave. The gates, as Charles had said, resisted her touch, cold and immovable. The servants avoided her eyes, whispering in corners, as if they knew what was coming. At night, she heard whispers through the walls. Voices calling her name, sometimes her father's, sometimes Thomas's. And always, the faint sound of hoofs striking stone. Charles tried to comfort her, but he too was breaking. She saw him pacing the library late into the night, muttering under his breath, his eyes hollow. He confessed to her once, in a broken voice, that Margaret had bound him not only with desire but with ritual. She used me, he said, to seal the house's claim. I don't know if I'm even my own man anymore. Eleanor wanted to pity him. But he had betrayed her, and worse, he had become Margaret's accomplice. Even now, he seemed unable to break free of her grip. On the third night, Eleanor made her decision. If Ravenscroft demanded blood, then she would give it something it had not expected. She would not kill the innocent. She would not let the house take her sister, Catherine, who remained blissfully ignorant of the horrors creeping around them. No, Eleanor would turn the curse back upon its mistress. She waited until Margaret was alone in the study, the great ledger of family accounts open before her. Candlelight flickered across Margaret's sharp features, making her look more like a queen upon a throne than a mother in her home. Eleanor stepped into the doorway. Mother, she said quietly, I've made my choice. Margaret looked up, her eyes glittering. Ah, at last, you've found sense. Tell me, who will it be? Charles, Catherine, one of the servants. Eleanor took a deep breath. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. You. For the first time in her life, Eleanor saw her mother truly startled. Margaret's face darkened, her lips tightening into a thin line. Then she laughed again, that cold, cruel laugh. Foolish child, Ravenscroft does not consume its chosen vessel. I am bound to it. I am its hand, its heart. Do you really think you can turn the house against me? Eleanor stepped forward, clutching her father's journal like a weapon. Yes, because even vessels can be broken. And I know how. At that moment, the fire in the hearth roared, sending sparks flying. The shadows along the walls writhed, taking on shapes, faces, twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Margaret rose to her feet, her silk gown whipping around her like storm clouds. You dare defy Ravenscroft, she thundered. Then you shall learn its wrath. The house shook violently, books tumbling from shelves, the chandelier swaying overhead. Eleanor held her ground, her eyes locked on her mother's. I'd rather die free, she whispered, than live as its slave. Part 8 ends with Ravenscroft trembling on the edge of violence. Margaret stands in fury, Eleanor in defiance, and the house itself awakening fully for the first time in years. The stage is set for the terrible confrontation to come. Part 9 The bargain in the foundations. Every curse has a beginning. Every shadow is born from a spark. And Eleanor Aldridge was about to uncover the secret that had damned her family for generations. The night Ravenscroft shook like thunder, Eleanor barely slept. Her confrontation with Margaret had ended without resolution. The walls still whispered, the portraits still watched, and Margaret still ruled the household like a queen enthroned in darkness. But Eleanor had something her mother did not, her father's journal. She read it again and again, hunting for clues. And at last, she found one. Tucked between entries about Edmund's failing health was a single line written in haste. Greater than, if the truth is ever sought, look beneath the stones where the house was born. The foundation remembers. Eleanor closed the book with trembling hands. Beneath the house. The foundations. At dawn, Eleanor slipped from her room. Catherine was still asleep, and Margaret's chamber door remained closed. She hurried to the servants' quarters, where she found Martha, the oldest maid, scrubbing floors. Martha, Eleanor whispered urgently, how long has your family served here? 3 generations, miss, Martha said, her wrinkled hands never pausing in their work. Then you must know the oldest parts of the manor. The cellars, the tunnels. Tell me where they are. Martha's eyes darted toward the door, as if afraid Margaret might be listening. At last, she leaned closer. There's a passage, miss. Behind the wine racks. It leads below the cellars, deeper than anyone dares go. My grandmother told me never to enter. Said the stones down there, they breathe. That night, candle in hand, Eleanor went alone. She slipped into the cellar, past rows of dusty bottles, until she found the rack Martha had spoken of. A careful push revealed the hidden door, its hinges groaning with age. The passage beyond smelled of earth and salt. The walls dripped with moisture, the air heavy and suffocating. Rats scurried across the stones as she descended. At last, the tunnel widened into a chamber carved directly from the bedrock beneath the manor. In its center stood an altar, black stone slick with centuries of damp. Strange carvings covered its surface, symbols that twisted in the flickering light. And at the base of the altar lay bones. Dozens of them, skulls cracked, ribs shattered, all jumbled together like offerings tossed aside. Eleanor's stomach turned. This was the foundation her father had written of. This was where the bargain had begun. On the far wall, barely visible through the grime, was an inscription. She wiped it clean with her sleeve and read aloud. Greater than, in blood was Ravenscroft raised. In blood shall it be sustained. One life each generation, freely given or cunningly taken, will bind the fortune to the name. Break the chain, and all shall fall. Her heart pounded. Now she understood. The Aldridge wealth, their power in Newport, their place among America's rising elite, it had all been bought by this pact. Each generation had offered a life, sometimes by choice, sometimes by murder, but always enough to keep the curse satisfied. Her mother had not invented the horror. She had only embraced it. As Eleanor stared at the inscription, she felt a presence behind her. "You've found it." She spun around, nearly dropping her candle. Charles stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes reflecting the weak flame. "Charles," she whispered, "did you know about this?" He stepped into the chamber, his gaze fixed on the altar. "Not at first. Margaret told me after I was already hers. She said the house would claim me unless I served it. Unless I helped her continue the bargain." His voice broke. "I never wanted this, Eleanor. But once you're bound, there's no escape." Eleanor shook her head fiercely. "There has to be. The inscription says the chain can be broken. If we refuse the sacrifice, if no one dies, then the fortune collapses, yes, but the curse ends too." Charles gave a bitter laugh. "And do you think Margaret would ever allow that? She'd kill 100 more before she let go of Ravenscroft's wealth." A sudden chill swept through the chamber. The candle sputtered, its flame shrinking. And from the darkness above, a low groan reverberated, like stone grinding against stone. The altar pulsed. The carvings seemed to writhe. Eleanor staggered back as the bones at its base shifted, rattling like dice. Charles grabbed her arm. "It knows we're here. We need to leave, now." They fled through the tunnel, the sound of rattling bones following them like footsteps. Only when they slammed the hidden door shut behind them did the noise fade. Back in her chamber, Eleanor collapsed on her bed, heart racing. The truth was worse than she had ever imagined. Ravenscroft was not simply haunted. It was alive, bound by a bargain of blood and greed. And her mother was its chosen servant. For the first time, Eleanor understood the depth of her danger. Margaret didn't merely want her silenced. She wanted her offered, to the house, to the altar, to the curse. The following evening, Margaret summoned Eleanor and Catherine to the grand dining hall. The table was set with silver candlesticks, the finest china, and bottles of vintage wine. "My dears," Margaret said with smooth grace, "I thought we might enjoy a family supper. Just the three of us." But Eleanor saw the truth in her mother's eyes. This was no supper. It was a ritual. As the servants withdrew, Margaret poured the wine herself. Her movements were elegant, precise, almost ceremonial. Eleanor watched the dark liquid swirl into her glass, and for an instant she thought it looked thicker than wine, more like blood. "To the Aldridge legacy," Margaret said, raising her glass. Catherine smiled, innocent and unknowing, and lifted hers. But Eleanor left her glass untouched. Margaret's gaze hardened. "Drink, Eleanor." Eleanor met her stare with quiet defiance. "No, I know what you are. And I know what this house is." Catherine looked between them, confusion clouding her face. "What are you talking about?" Margaret's smile turned razor sharp. "She's been reading old stories. Nonsense written by men too weak to shoulder the weight of destiny. But you, Eleanor, you could have been strong. Instead, you chose rebellion." The candles flickered wildly, as if stirred by a breath no one could see. And in that moment, Eleanor realized the house itself was listening, waiting for Margaret's command. Part 9 ends here, with Eleanor refusing the poisoned wine, Catherine caught in the middle, and Margaret preparing to finish what generations had begun. The bargain was nearing its breaking point, but whether it would end in freedom or death remained to be seen. Right finger, do you want me to continue with the final part 10, where the curse reaches its violent climax and the true fate of Ravenscroft is revealed? Part 10, The Last Supper at Ravenscroft. Every curse demands its ending. Every story of blood reaches its final night. And now, the Aldridge family sat together for the last supper Ravenscroft would ever see. Margaret Aldridge stood at the head of the dining table, her glass raised high, her smile sharp as a knife. The candles flickered in their silver holders, casting long shadows on the carved oak walls. Catherine sat wide-eyed, not yet understanding, while Eleanor sat rigid, her glass untouched. "Drink," Margaret commanded, her voice smooth but edged with fury. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I will never give myself to your curse." The air seemed to tighten around them. The flames bent toward Margaret as if bowing to her will. Catherine shivered, whispering, "Mother, what is happening?" Margaret's gaze never left Eleanor. Your father was too weak to embrace the truth. But I will not allow weakness to end our legacy. One of you will drink. One of you will bleed. Ravenscroft must be fed. Before Eleanor could reply, a heavy crash echoed through the hall. The great doors swung open, and Charles staggered in, pale and trembling. Margaret, he gasped, stop this before it's too late. The altar is awake, the bones are moving. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Traitor. But Eleanor seized the moment. Rising from her chair, she faced both her mother and the shadows that seemed to gather behind her. The curse only has power because we give it power. If we refuse it, if no one dies, then the chain breaks. The fortune may vanish, the house may crumble, but we will be free. The walls groaned, as if the house itself disagreed. A deep rumble shook the floor, rattling the silverware. Catherine whimpered, covering her ears. Make it stop. Margaret's composure cracked. She slammed her glass against the table, the red liquid spilling like fresh blood. You fool. Do you think freedom comes without sacrifice? Ravenscroft is our power. Without it, we are nothing. Her eyes gleamed with a terrible hunger. Better one daughter lost than a dynasty destroyed. She lunged for Catherine. No, Eleanor cried, leaping forward. She shoved Catherine aside, putting herself between her sister and her mother. Margaret's nails caught Eleanor's arm, drawing blood, and the candles flared so high their flames licked the ceiling. The house groaned again, louder this time, like a beast enraged by hunger denied. Charles grabbed a fallen candlestick and held it between them. Eleanor, remember the inscription. Break the chain. Eleanor's mind raced. The inscription had said, in blood was Ravenscroft raised. In blood shall it be sustained. Break the chain, and all shall fall. Her eyes fell on the spilled wine, crimson on the tablecloth. Her own blood dripping from her arm. The symbols carved beneath the house. And she knew, the curse was not just hunger, it was a pact. To end it, the pact had to be rejected with blood freely given, not stolen. Eleanor seized the candlestick from Charles, its flame fierce and steady. She turned to her mother, her voice ringing with resolve. You want sacrifice? Then I will give mine, not to feed this curse, but to end it. Before Margaret could stop her, Eleanor pressed the flame to her wounded arm, searing the cut. Blood hissed as it fell onto the floorboards, black smoke curling upward. The entire house screamed. The portraits rattled on their hooks, dishes shattered, and the chandelier above swayed violently. Margaret staggered back, her face twisted in horror. What have you done? Eleanor's voice rose above the chaos. I break the chain. I end Ravenscroft's hold. The walls cracked open. Dust rained from the ceiling. From beneath the floor, a sound like 1,000 bones collapsing filled the hall. The altar below was breaking, its pact undone. Margaret shrieked, clutching at the air as if trying to hold the house together with her bare hands. No, you cannot take this from me. But it was not Eleanor who took it, it was the house itself, devouring its mistress. Shadows rose from the floor, wrapping around Margaret's arms, her neck, pulling her downward. She clawed at the table, at the air, at her daughters, but the darkness swallowed her whole. Her final scream echoed through Ravenscroft as the curse dragged her into the foundations where it had begun. And then, silence. The candles sputtered out. The groaning ceased. The house stood still. Catherine clung to Eleanor, sobbing. Charles collapsed against the wall, his face pale with shock. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Eleanor whispered, "It's over." But as she looked around the hall, the cracked walls, the fallen chandelier, the ruined feast, she knew Ravenscroft itself would not stand much longer. The curse was broken, but so too was the foundation of everything her family had built. The Aldridge name, once gilded in wealth and fear, was finished. They left that night, stepping out into the cold sea air as dawn broke over Newport. Behind them, Ravenscroft loomed in silence, its windows dark, its stones weakened. Eleanor did not look back. The fortune would fade, the manor would decay, but she and Catherine would live free of its blood price. And for Eleanor, that was enough. But some say, On certain nights, when the wind rattles through the cliffs and the sea crashes against the rocks, Ravenscroft still groans, its stones whispering. And if you venture too close, you might hear Margaret's voice, calling from beneath the foundations, still begging for blood to restore her throne. Movie camera call to action. If you felt the chill of this historic horror story, don't let Ravenscroft's curse fade into silence. Right finger subscribe for more haunting tales. Right finger share this story with those who dare to walk in the shadows. Right finger and comment below. Do you believe curses can be broken, or do they only sleep, waiting for the next soul to awaken them? Because history remembers, and so do the dead.